Good afternoon, and welcome to the Middle East Forum's weekly podcast series. My name is Lauri Regan, and on behalf of MEF, I want to thank you all for joining today and for your continued support of the critically important work that we do. I'm very happy to be joined this afternoon by the brilliant Dominic Green, breaking down for us what is happening to the American right, including the struggle for control of its key institutions, as well as the way in which the ideological divides that have appeared could reshape U.S.-Israel relations. Dominic is a contributor to the Wall Street Journal, where his column, The MAGA Rights Anti-Semitism Problem, was recently published and is a must-read. He is also a columnist for the Washington Examiner and the Jewish Chronicle, among other impressive positions and accomplishments, which you can read in the bio that was set forth in the invitation to today's podcast. I encourage you to follow all of his very important work, including his tweets on X, which are always very insightful. Dominic will speak for about 15 minutes, followed by a 15-minute Q&A session. So if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to use the Q&A or chat function at the bottom of your screen to enter your submission, and we'll do our best to get to as many of your questions as possible. I once again ask you for your continued patience as we transition to this new streaming platform. There may still be a few glitches, so we thank you in advance for your understanding. Today's podcast is being recorded and will be available for future viewing, so please do share the link with those in your networks who you think would be interested in learning more on this important and timely topic. Welcome, Dominic, and thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. I hand the floor over to you.
Thank you, Lauri. And after an introduction like that, it's going to be downhill all the way, I fear. Well, I'll start by saying that the current controversy has a history. This is not the first time that the right in America has split over racism and over isolationism. In the longer perspective, what you're seeing is a 21st century digital round of the kind of dispute which has always been fought and refought on the fringes and the underbelly of the right in the US. In the 1950s, this was called the old right, and William F. Buckley famously shaped modern conservative movement by excluding the John Birchers and the Cranks and the Freaks. In the 1990s, in the 1992 Republican nomination competition in particular, Patrick Buchanan revived many of these themes. And then if you add the internet to that, you get a further iteration of it, which has gathered steam over the last 10 to 15 years. Its current leader has become Tucker Carlson. And I say become because Tucker Carlson was actually the leader of what we would think of as the previous form of conservative media, which was cable news. He was the leading light of Fox until he left under a cloud following a legal dispute. But he has reinvented himself as a podcaster. And it's the development of social media which has allowed previously marginal and fringe and very sordid voices to dress themselves up in the glamour of modern digital entertainment. And thus it was in late October that Tucker Carlson interviews, as part of the parade of freaks, cranks, and weirdos who are just asking questions, a young man called Nick Fuentes, who for several years has been appointed himself the leader of effectively a white nationalist youth movement, which they call themselves gropers, and so we therefore are obliged to call them that too. And this was widely criticized, not just by me, but by many other people, for effectively giving Fuentes the endorsement of Tucker Carlson, who, despite his recent deviation into the circus, still retains a kind of authority, as well as one of the largest podcast audiences in the US. So at this point, I don't know if you want to ask a question about that saga of foolishness that I've just recounted, but that we will then perhaps talk about the institutional combat which is taking place.
Well, I actually have a lot of questions for you, but I know that the audience is going to as well. So I'm going to let you talk a little bit more about generally what we're seeing
Great.
on the right.
Well, in that case, we come to the second stage, as it were. All radical movements, MAGA is one of them, face a choice between fading away when their original leadership leaves the game or loses its charisma, or becoming institutionalized as a ruling party. And we know despite the fantasies of some people on the left, and perhaps despite Donald Trump's own imagination, that he will almost certainly not be in office after 2028. And therefore, the question of a succession and a struggle for power over the MAGA brand, which was always an idea more than a political ideology, all of that has now started to come to the surface. And it emerged that it had been making inroads into the Heritage Foundation, which, for a long time was a very staid, centrist organization, priding itself on being solid, even boring, and in fact turned out to be far more exciting than it should have been. And it seems to have been very susceptible to this racist youth movement, in part because Tucker Carlson had a relationship with it. And Heritage, its leader, Kevin Roberts, in my opinion, badly mishandled the public response. He was either unable to formulate, I don't care, you can say what you want, this is what we're going to do, or to say, oh, this is really bad and I've made some mistakes. And as we speak, he is still amazingly in the job, but I just don't think that he's going to be there for much longer. And that's a sign, in fact, of this succession struggle in the Republican Party and on the right now moving into the institutions. Most of the other institutions, the big think tanks in Washington, D.C., came out strongly against Carlson, Fuentes, and so on. And then we come to the real pivotal goal of the whole thing, which is JD Vance, who has positioned himself as, the heir apparent. And he is, of course, vice president, which literally puts him in that spot. At least in a normal administration, it would. And so therefore there is a shadow war going on, as it were, for and against JD Vance. And again, he, like Kevin Roberts, has revealed himself to be an inefficient politician. He, in my opinion anyway, he's made basic mistakes. He has a golden opportunity here to do what William F. Buckley did in the early 1960s and say, these people are idiots, cranks, downright un-American, and we don't want anything to do with them. And by doing that, of course, Buckley was able to take control of what had been a very various movement and pull all the threads together. And Vance, of course, has been presented with a prime opportunity to do much the same. And I can't emphasize how weirdly and strongly anti-American so many of these crank figures on the right are. They really are making excuses, every possible excuse for Russia over Ukraine. They really are defending Iran's campaign for a nuclear weapon. They really are open-minded and just asking questions about, whether Islamist campaigns of subversion in the institutions of the West are, not as bad as they might look. They are enormously sympathetic to every possible anti-American current, even to the point, as Tucker Carlson recently did, finding the good in Maduro. That the right is going round the horseshoe. So strongly is it hostile, this group anyway, to Jews in Israel. That they are becoming the caricature of the left, which they have been attacking for so many years over the last 10 or 15 years, in fact. Whether they're able to drag the entire conservative movement or the Republican Party, and of course those are two different things, whether they're able to drag them in their wake, we're seeing now. And I don't think that they're going to be able to do that, actually. I think this is a heavily on-mind phenomenon. I don't believe that most Americans are becoming racist cranks overnight, which they necessarily have to be to elect a candidate who backed this. So as we speak, and things may change, Vance appears to have tied his fortunes or allowed himself to have become tied to the biggest losers.
So I just want to direct the audience to your recent column in the Washington Examiner, which was entitled, It's Crunch Time for Vance. And you did state in that article that he's the man of the hour, as the man of the hour, he must rise to it or become yesterday's man. One of my frustrations with this whole thing, and I'm going to take the liberty of asking the first question to you, Dominic, is the lack of leadership that I see on the part of both Trump and Vance. Personally, I'd love to see an Oval Office speech by Trump on anti-Semitism more generally, because it's just gotten so out of control. But you point out that Vance does not seem to be stepping up to that occasion right now. And in fact, he hasn't even defended the racist terms that were directed at his wife and his children by Fuentes. What he did do today, though, on Twitter was defend his staffer, which happens to be Tucker Carlson's son, Buckley, which is not the same Buckley Carlson as Tucker's brother, who is a Fuentes fan. So Vance was out there today defending his brother. Defending his staffer, Carlson's son. What are your thoughts, a little bit delving deeper on this, on what we would want to see from Vance and Trump, who, by the way, in the New York Times today defended Carlson in his interview with Fuentes?
He sort of semi-defended him, didn't he? I mean, I'll start with the easier one in a way, which is Vance. JD Vance is a personal friend, as he says, of Tucker Carlson, and Carlson's son works for Vance. Carlson's brother, who has the same name as Carlson's son. I mean, this thing is, a comedy turning into a tragedy, isn't it? There's the older Buckley Carlson, there's the younger Buckley Carlson, and neither of them seem to have anything in common with William F. Buckley. So there's actually three Buckleys now, I realize, in this story. Obviously, it's interesting in the way of lightning striking twice that both Buckley and Tucker Carlson seem to have an unseemly obsession with Jews. But that's not the end of the United States. It is, however, a very bad thing to have racists and racist adjacent people in the White House. Donald Trump has demonstrated, I think, by his own actions where he stands on these things. But he's also demonstrated that fundamentally he doesn't care too much about the associations and company that he keeps. And at times it reflects very badly on him. At one point, remember, Nick Fuentes ended up in Mar-a-Lago as a guest of Kanye West, who, is a head case. These kind of associations reflect badly on the office and badly also on the judgment of the man, and we've got used to that. But we will also have to allow for the fact that Trump is probably the most pro-Israel president in American history. And as a man with, Jewish children, daughters-in-law, grandchildren, is more invested than most, as he pointed out when he was speaking at the Knesset in Jerusalem recently. So this chaotic, disorderly, Trump procedure shouldn't be confused with the actual substance of policy. We have enough to go on now, I believe, to judge him in this. Vance is a different thing. Vance is a political work in progress who's been associated with a series of powerful mentors, Peter Thiel, for instance, Carlson himself, who really cleared the path for Vance to become a senator in some ways by giving him the airtime, and now Trump, with Vance is Trump's effect, as I said, heir presumptive, but it's nothing should be presumed at all. And in fact, Vance being a work in progress actually is not a good index. He should be the finished thing as a vice president if he wants to move into, the nomination in the way, that Gore, for instance, followed Clinton. That kind of thing. You need to have you need to be credible and need to be effectively a political adult. Holding together a coalition does not mean trying to negotiate or bend a knee to its nastiest, almost vocal element, which is effectively how he is looking. Now, perhaps there is some 4D chess in which I'm missing out here as a mere mortal, and perhaps Vance is going to pull the rabbit from the hat and emerge looking presidential and, kick out the head cases. That's also possible. But this is the moment to do it, and the clock is ticking. And as you were saying, just today there was a further twist in it. Trump did one of his, whatever statements, which was not clear water, which would have been smart. Vance picked a fight online with a Jewish American journalist who had asked quite reasonably, well, look, if all the Carlson family are cranks, I wonder what the young guy who's working in your office as a public servant might think about these questions. That actually is what journalists are meant to ask. This is the context. This is the individual. They're being paid by the taxpayer. What do they think about this? And for Vance to go off on X as he did is not just unpresidential, it's kind of not very adult. It's not grown-up behavior. And as then lots of people pointed out, he was a lot faster to fire off the angry tweet in this instance than he has been against the campaign of insults and racist goading that he has had from, the fringe. And to be fair to him, yes, last year he did ridicule and dismiss Nicholas Fuentes as being beneath consideration. But the point is, He has to consider him, actually, because thanks to his good friend Tucker Carlson, Fuentes and these racists and conspiracists have actually managed to secure a foothold in the Heritage Foundation, perhaps elsewhere in D.C., but obviously on the staff of members of Congress and so on. So they are actually not dismissible. However ridiculous or stupid they are, nasty they appear, they cannot be dismissed because thanks, as I said, to Vance's friend, and thanks also to the kind of MAGA right intellectuals who are most excited by the prospect of a Vance candidacy, they are actually inside the tent. And so day by day, Vance is doing tremendous damage, I believe, to his candidacy for 2028.
Where do you think, someone asked where you thought the Vance-Rubio dynamic might play out? Rubio's already said that if Vance runs, he's entitled to the top of the ticket. Do you have any thoughts on Rubio?
I think that anything anyone says at this point has to be taken hypothetically, and then there's a lot of edging and shuffling and waiting to see who's going to jump first. What I would say, and this is just pure speculation on my part, Donald Trump is still in the hot seat and will still want the attention right up until the last minute. And he has form in this regard in his previous career as a reality TV act. I suspect he will want some kind of open primary or some kind of public theatrical involving Vance, Rubio, DeSantis, and anyone else who feels like throwing their hat in, because that, of course, would be one way of Trump remaining at the absolute center of Republican politics right up, or close to the end anyway, until the 28 campaign begins. Otherwise, he's going to, as we're seeing now, be overlooked. It's astonishing to see that it's only in November that his return was this earth-shattering thing that shocked everybody, became the most important story in the world. A year later, everyone's talking about him already almost as in the past tense, which I think is a mistake because we've actually got the best part of 3 years to go. And so I can imagine that he would prefer that Vance wouldn't automatically inherit the crown.
There's someone that thought that we were ignoring the anti-Semitism and the lack of leadership on the left, but the topic today was, the divide, the ideological divide on the right. But I will take that question and ask you if you could maybe compare what I view as a civil war in the GOP to what's taking place between the more traditional centrist Democrats versus the progressive socialist wing of the Democrat Party.
Right. Well, yeah, I think that's a very good question. And I think there are two things to say. One is anybody who was appalled by what happened to the Democrats, where a small, well-organized and politically extreme group were able to form alliances with other extremists and burrow like termites into the institutions until they had undermined the party and all its citadels, in effect, which is catastrophic, of course, for the Democrats. And you saw the results last November. Anyone who's concerned about that should be very concerned that the Republicans and the right will undergo the same process, because I think it is the same process. One name that people have applied to this right racist fringe is woke right. And I think there's a lot to be said to that, not just because they are identity politics people. They just happen to be the identity politics of angry whites. Also because their methods and their self-pity and their grievance and resentment fits the same template as that of the woke left that we've all endured for several years. So I do think actually it's worth remembering the parallel to the left. But there's a big difference, which is they won on the left. They took over the left institutions in a process of decades, which really began with the subverting of universities and then the lower levels of education. Over a process of decades, we're only really in the very early phase of that kind of assault. And some kind of fight was bound to happen because mainstream conservative fusionism effectively collapsed in between the Iraq War and the financial crash of 2007-8. The struggle that came out of it produced, of course, the Trump presidency and the idea of MAGA, which, as I said, is an idea waiting to be filled in. It's not a coherent ideology. There's not a little booklet, the little red book of MAGA, and then you know what you're getting. So that kind of struggle was bound to happen. The upside, if it turns out that way, could be that you get a real 21st century popular conservatism that has broad appeal. And if you look at the Trump voter coalition of 2024, that's the sort of drift that you see. Trump did better among minority voters than any Republican candidate has done in decades. The downside, if this current battle is allowed to play out, or let alone if the sane, moderate, reasonable people lose, the downside is you have a party hollowed out from within, which then becomes a vehicle for white nationalists, in effect. And that would be a catastrophe for all Americans, and it would be probably a catastrophe for the rest of the world as well, because accompanying this, and we've been talking a lot about the domestic aspect, accompanying this is the dreamland of isolationism. Now, isolationism was not possible in the 1700s, when Washington was saying avoiding foreign entanglements. It certainly wasn't possible in the 1930s. It's even less possible now. There's no such thing as being a serious power and being isolationist. What it means actually is you get pushed around by other people who still have assertive foreign policies and correctly understand isolationism as a retreat. And nature abhors a vacuum, and therefore your rivals will immediately and very cheaply move into the spaces that you vacate. So the domestic and international stakes for this are tremendously important. And I am quite heartened by the fact that the vast majority of the conservative think tanks, who like to think of themselves as the brains of the right, and the vast majority also of elected Republicans are rightly abhorrent about this. They recognize this as a poison, that in a multiracial society, having a party of racists is just a disaster. So I am heartened by the fact that many on the right have actually spoken out and rejected this and shown convictions that, as we saw, many on the left failed to show and thus suffered from.
Thank you, Dominic. That was very insightful. Somebody is asking, and just a reminder to the audience, feel free to post a question using the chat function at the bottom of the screen. Somebody asked what your thoughts are on the degree of influence of Qatari money on Carlson and other influencers.
There's a lot of talk about this online. I've only seen one piece of evidence, which was that a Washington, D.C. PR firm, basically, which was put on a retainer by the Qataris, organized, interviews for Carlson. But he's interviewed lots of people in the Middle East, including the rivals of Qatar, for instance, figures in Saudi Arabia. My understanding of the economics of the new media business is he's making lots of money by taking his old media cable audience and getting subscriptions and clicks and selling them, coffee and all the other slightly Alex Jonesy type of things which were sold in the old media model. So he's probably making lots of money from that without actually getting a brown envelope from a third party. One good point, which I think has not been examined enough, however, is how much of the audience for this stuff, for this conspiracism, the anti-Americanism, the anti-Semitism of it, how much of the audience is actually outside the US? Because we forget that, the whole world speaks English, and the whole world, if it's allowed to, watches American stuff online. So from what I've read, and it's hard to confirm it because this is still a new phenomenon, but what I'm reading, a great deal of the audience is actually outside the US. So it looks to us like you see the thing and it says, 2 million people saw this interview of Tucker Carlson and the guy who thinks Winston Churchill is the villain of World War II. And you think, what, there are 2 million completely deluded Americans? That's a dangerous threat to the Republic. Well, actually, there might not be 2 million of them. They might only be 500,000 of them, and the other 1.5 might be all over the world. We actually don't know that, but it is worth bearing that in mind. A lot of this content, as it's called, is being created for outside the US. And there are foreign actors, of course, who are spending huge amounts of money to try and influence the domestic debate. And social media is the back door into American debate. Russia, Qatar, China, Iran, all of them pouring vast amounts of money and influence. And again, it's not necessary for someone like Carlson to take a single cent from any of those. It just so happens that the material he's producing aligns and is spread by those kind of influence networks. And it's quite surreal almost to hear somebody saying, yeah, I'm a patriot and I'm defending my country, yet making money out of doing it down on behalf of a foreign audience. But that is the kind of incentives that the digital politics and digital communications have created.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you a question. We've talked about Heritage and Kevin Roberts and that fiasco. I'm still unclear on how Kevin survived this, but he seemingly has. We haven't talked about Turning Point. Tucker Carlson is the new face of Turning Point USA, and he's out on campuses, not at all carrying himself the way Charlie Kirk did. What are your thoughts on Turning Point? I'm very disappointed that they haven't cut ties. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, I mean, the first thing I would say is, and it applies to MAGA as well, which is if you have a movement which is founded by a charismatic individual, and then they are, in Kirk's case, murdered, or in Trump's case, they leave the stage, their movement usually actually dies with them. What Kirk created was a 21st century digital version of the broad church fusionist idea that you can have lots of different factions in the right and agree on basic principles, particularly, for instance, free debate. Most of the people on this insurgent extremist right absolutely hated Kirk. I can't tell you for how many years I heard these people denouncing Kirk as a fake and a Reaganite and guy who was basically being dressed up in the old outfit and the old bow tie, as it were, of 1980s conservatism. They absolutely hated and detested and loathed him. And then you see the same people crying crocodile tears immediately after his murder, and even worse, then clambering aboard the vehicle and trying to send it in a different direction. Because we talk a lot about his legacy, but a big part of Kirk's legacy is the status and the mailing list and the connections that he created through Turning Point USA. Now, I would say this: if the conservative movement had kept up with the times and had paid more attention to the younger people, and by young in the conservative movement, I mean under 60, if they had kept up with the times, there probably would be more than one vehicle in competition. You know, it wouldn't just be Turning Point USA is the key to the young, which is the presumption now. So there's been a real failure on the right to move with the times, to understand, in particular, the position that the younger generations are in. You know, the world since 2008 has been very different economically, and their prospects are very different. And their education has been very different as well. All these things are easily exploited. So it's unseemly is the nicest possible way of describing the way in which people have tried to commandeer Turning Point USA. In the long term, I don't see it actually as having legs. I don't think an organization like that really can continue.
That would be my take, and it's very disappointing to hear you say that as well. Dexter Van Zyl asked, in the aftermath of JFK's assassination, we saw the rise of a number of conspiracy theories. How do we respond to this same problem in the aftermath of Charlie Kirk's assassination?
Well, firstly, hello, Dexter, and thank you. I hope all is well. Secondly, he is right, of course, that the phrase conspiracy theory moved into everyday speech in the mid-1960s as a way of denouncing anyone who queried the findings of the Warren Commission, the immediate official analysis of what had taken place. And of course, eventually, the official analysis discredited much of the Warren Commission. I am of the view to avoid that kind of thing, which is very damaging to our institutions and our trust in each other, let alone in the government. I think we should have the maximum airing and access of all the information. There's a lot of talk online, for instance, about the Charlie Kirk assassination, about Thomas Crooks, who took a shot at and winged President Trump in Butler, Pennsylvania in 2024. These things should not be withheld. They should be open to the public to the maximum degree. And I think by doing that, you take away the conspiracists' greatest appeal, which is to say what you think is going on is not what's going on. And you know that because they're not telling us. And in that gap, you can add any number of nonsensical but appealing ideas. So the freer the circulation of information, the more the government tells us about what it knows, the better position people are in. And I am one of those people. I actually have a high degree of confidence in people when it comes to this. I don't think most people are going to lose their marbles and succumb to these things at all. Given a reasonably uncontaminated supply of information, they will jump to the correct conclusions. And as I said, the speculation and the deliberate attempts to mislead that you get instead are very damaging to all levels of society. And as I said, a lot of it is encouraged by actors, foreign actors, who bear great ill will, in fact, to American democracy.
Thank you, Dominic. There's still a number of questions in the queue, but unfortunately, we've run out of time. I really appreciate you taking the time this afternoon, and the audience for also listening in. I hope that you all can join us on Wednesday for Israel Insider with Ashley Perry. And then we also have the Forum Roundtable on Friday on anti-Israel bias in the media, a wonderful roundtable on Friday at 11:30 a.m. Dominic, again, thank you for all you do. Is there a place that our audience the best place to follow your work?
Well, I mean, I'm writing regularly for the Journal and Washington Examiner, and sometimes at Free Press, and on a monthly basis for the Jewish Chronicle of London, so you can find out what's going on there as well. But no, I'd like to thank you, and I'm very sorry that I didn't get to answer all the questions. I talk too much, I suspect, but thank you. The questions I got were excellent.
Well, thank you so much for joining, and we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Have a good afternoon, everyone.
Thank you.